So last year, my house, I don't know if you remember, it was a shell, and in a crazy scheduling decision, my husband and I, and a few friends I see in the room that helped us, in 6 days, like last year, we built the shell of that house and pulled it here. It was the paper boat house. Doesn't anyone remember it had the angled walls? Yeah. So, yeah, we've got a lot of beautiful hands in the room there've been a lot of great support to help that come together. So tomorrow on the tiny house, or it's a local house tour. We have a lot of different kind of houses on that tour. My house and my husband, also wherever he is, there he is. He's got the cute hat in the back. So he built that house, and then I built the house that we're going to live in. So you can come and see that. Our house is on the tour tomorrow. I highly recommend it. We've got a lot of really cool, different kinds of structures. So we're not a kind of one-size-fits-all tiny house festival. Tiny houses are kind of that shiny object at the center of a really meaningful conversation around housing. And how we can look at it creatively, we can consider resilience, and we can also consider equity in housing. So we have a lot of different kinds of presenters today to talk about all aspects of building, housing, policy, and we also this year added a whole component around creative placemaking. So we're gonna explain a little bit about creative placemaking, and what I'll say is it's really about a sense of place, so that the people in a community help to define our public spaces by who lives there. So we're really interested in that balance between public space and private space. Maybe downsizing our private spaces and upsizing our public spaces so we have more places to connect as a community. So those kinds of themes will be threaded throughout the day. So I would like to introduce the MC of our North Stage, Cynthia Sheldon.
Hi. As Erin pointed out, you're demonstrating your resilience simply by being here, so thank you very much. I've actually been interested and obsessed with tiny houses since 1989. I lived in Portland, Oregon, where they were doing a contest for the homeless people to try to figure out how to deal with the homeless people, and artists were designing not quite tiny houses, but different ways for people to stay on the street, but be safe, warm, dry. And my favorite one was kind of like a coffin on wheels. And it was just long enough to sleep in. And they could throw their stuff in it, wheel it around during the day, and then padlock it to something. That was in 1989. That was the winner. And then you close yourself up in it at night, lock the door, and you're safe. Presumably if nobody cuts the lock and wheels you away. So we have a lot of people coming up on this speaking event today. We have educators, legislators, artists, makers, planners, community builders, entrepreneurs, and people who design public spaces. Can you think of in your community any place that's just like this raggedy little spot in your community that collects trash? Off the top of your head. Can you imagine something like that? Just like let me know you hear me. Like, can you think of a spot? Can you think of a spot in your community that could use beautification or utilization? Because there's going to be a guy up here who's going to be talking about that as well. And it seems like there's been more and more of that community gardening and making it a usable feature. And Brattleboro is a great example of that.
Good afternoon. So I'm Senator Becca Balint, and I represent Windham County along with Senator Jeanette White, who is from Putney. I live here in Brattleboro with my family. I'm also the majority leader in the Senate. And I'm here today because one of the committees that I serve on in the Senate is Economic Development and Housing Committee. So I do a lot of work with the two women sitting next to me, and it's a great honor to be sharing this space with them because they're people that I look to all the time, not just for information, but for inspiration. So I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here, and thank you everybody for braving this wonderful weather. It's a real treat. So, y'all from Vermont? Is everybody from Vermont that's here? Yeah, we knew you'd all be here. Great. I'm Katie Buckley. I was appointed in January as the Commissioner for the Department of Housing and Community Development. I live in Guilford, right next door with my family, and I have done a lot of work in my community of Guilford, where I worked for 8 years for the municipality, and then I had the honor of working for Windham and Windsor Housing Trust with someone who I see in the audience right now, who was one of my colleagues there as Director of Housing Development. And so I'm going to be bringing more of that perspective today than my state hat, because I think it's a little bit more relevant at this given moment. So, and next to me is Jen Holler.
Hi, I'm Jen Holler. I'm the Director of Policy for the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. VHCB is a statewide organization, quasi-public, and we administer state dollars and make them available to communities and nonprofits for affordable housing. We also do a lot of conservation work as well and blend those two together. In the past, I've had the opportunity to work in state government at the local level for nonprofit, and was also privileged to be able to be part of the Irene recovery as it related to housing issues, and worked a lot with this community of Brattleboro during that period. So looking forward to this conversation. You folks are incredibly well represented by Senator Balint, and then also having your local talent as the state's housing commissioner. So it's going to promises to be a good conversation, and I look forward to hearing where you all would like it to go.
So one of the things that we wanted to start with is that the three of us were able to work on a very exciting project this year in state government. And I do think it's one of the most important things that we were able to do this year in the legislature, which was passing the largest housing bond that had ever been passed here in the state of Vermont. And we were able to do it across political party. And the three of us, I have to say, if there are three people that worked behind the scenes in the State House to try to make this happen, we were not the only ones to get it over the finish line, but the fact that we could communicate well with each other allowed us to get it over the finish line. So in order to understand why we needed such a large housing bond for new housing starts and for rehabs, I think it's important to talk about where we were before in terms of our housing situation. And I know you too know about that so acutely, and we can speak to some of the information that you had.
Sure. I just wanted to provide some numbers. They're a little bit dry, but I think that they'll add good perspective to the conversation that we're going to have. So just bear with me as I rattle these off, but it's really good context. In Vermont, all of the information I'm giving you is in Vermont. Our minimum wage is $10 an hour. $12.51 per hour is the average renter wage. $1,139 per month is the fair market rent for a two-bedroom apartment. $21.90 per hour is the housing wage you must earn to afford this two-bedroom apartment, and that equates to $45,545 a year in annual income. $520 a month is the rent affordable to those earning minimum wage.
So will you give that number again, Commissioner?
Sure. $520 a month. If you're earning minimum wage, that is the most that you can pay for rent and have it be affordable. If you're earning minimum wage, the amount of hours that you would need to work per week to pay for your $1,139 market rate two-bedroom apartment is 88.8 hours a week. $650 a month is the rent that's affordable to those who are earning the average renter wage, which I said was $12.51 an hour. You must work 70 hours a week at the renter wage to be able to afford that $1,100 apartment. Renters make up 29% of our housing, 74,000, give or take, renter households versus 255,000 in total. And Vermont is the 13th most expensive state in the nation to rent.
Okay, so clearly what's embedded in there is what you all know at the local level, which is it's incredibly difficult to find affordable rental housing if you're able to find a unit that's even open. So The numbers tell a story. Those of you on the ground here in Windham County know it up front.
Sure, and I think one of the reasons that there's so much interest and intrigue around the tiny house movement is for exactly these reasons. Affordable housing is incredibly difficult to come by, and then of course it also resonates in terms of environmental and social justice and other values that many of us share. But this, the rental housing and affordable housing crunch in Vermont is part of a national trend. The former Secretary of HUD talked about the national rental housing crisis, and rents nationally are at the highest level that they've been for the last 3 decades. So the challenges in Vermont are real. They're part of a national economy and a national situation, but there are things that we can do here in Vermont to address them, and we've got a good framework on which to build on those, and that's in part what led to the call Governor Scott recommended, and the legislature quickly embraced the idea of a major new state investment in affordable housing, and that will flow through the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board and be available to communities like Brattleboro, other towns in Windham County for new and creative affordable housing options, and that's what we're here to talk about.
And Jen, I'd like to stay with you for a moment because I think it's important for folks to understand that although this administration did put forward the framework for the bond, this is something we've been talking about at the state level for over a decade, that we are in greatly in short supply, not just of affordable housing as it's defined by HUD, but also workforce housing. And I'm wondering if either one of you could talk about, it's not a great term because we know most people who are in lower income housing are also working. So
80.8 hours a week.
Exactly, 80 hours a week. But if you could speak to how we stretched a little bit the definition of how that housing would be
Sure, I could be happy to do that. So really since the Great Depression, since after that period, there's been some role for government to play in making housing affordable to people who are at very low incomes. Essentially, builders, developers, they cannot create housing at a price that the rents will cover for people who are at those lower incomes, and there's long been a federal role, and since 1987, actually 30 years ago this year, the state created its own funding mechanism through the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. Well, in many ways, Vermont's situation is better than it is nationally because of the resources that have gone into that, but we are still feeling this crunch. And because of the national trends and the economic trends around housing costs, and because wages have been really flat, that it's now become the case that in addition to it no longer being economically feasible for people to build housing that's affordable for very low and low income people, it's now pretty much impossible for private developers in the market to build housing, apartments or houses that's affordable to people who are really at moderate and middle income ranges. So that just added fuel and frankly broader support for a bigger state investment. And the legislature, we've got incredible advocates there and had been pushing this for years. And then, frankly, because it started to affect business more and affect more middle income people, that brought in a broader range of support for folks. And so the housing bond is designed to help both the most vulnerable, those who make very, very low incomes, but then also create housing that's kind of in that middle income range.
Yeah, as someone who is new to the whole state government structure, it was amazing for me to walk into an environment in which the issue that was my issue that I was appointed for had support across the board. There was nobody who really, I think I'm not exaggerating in saying that didn't support the housing bond. The question really was, how do you fund it? And in the end, we figured it out because the need is that great. It is an important issue. It's difficult to live here. It's expensive to live here, to find a house, to find a rental unit. There is such a tight rental market throughout the state that to have a healthy vacancy rating, which is about 4%, there are communities, and lots of them, that are just over 0%. So even if you want to live there, there's nowhere for you to live. So it's a huge issue, and the only way to do it is to really increase the supply of housing. And the housing bond is wonderful in that regard, in that it will provide housing opportunities for the full spectrum of housing. So in creating housing, it'll sort of loosen up the market and people can find the right fit for where they need to be in it.
One of the things, Jen, that I wonder if you could comment on is that as the person at the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board who's going to be overseeing a lot of this bond, I would love for you to speak to that tension that we have in Vermont between needing more housing, more affordable housing, and the desire to preserve more space for the common good, because they're all housed within your organization and they are sometimes seemingly in conflict with each other.
Sure. So we're really fortunate in Vermont, I think, because the development community and the conservation community understand and appreciate each other's values. And I can't take credit for this because I wasn't there 30 years ago, but whoever conceived of putting housing and conservation together in a funding mechanism, I think, was really brilliant. If you follow through the public policy conversations in the State House, if you just watching local news and media, you don't see the kind of conflict between developers and environmentalists that are often found in other states. That can be engaged in some pretty heavy-duty battles that takes up resources and kills time. And in Vermont, we've all come together around an agreement about preserving our compact settlement pattern and leaving the lands outside that as natural areas or working land. So we really focus development on the existing communities and just a little bit outside them. So with that sort of broad agreement and principles, and actually Commissioner Buckley's department runs the state designation program, which is really the largest mechanism for focusing kind of state grants and incentives in those areas. So that's what facilitates a lot of that development. And for those reasons, we're able to avoid spending lots of time and money arguing about where the housing ought to be and actually put the money into the housing.
Commissioner Buckley, do you mind talking about the districts and how they're
The designations? Yeah, there are 5 designations in the state of Vermont, and I welcome you all to visit our website to learn more. The primary ones really are downtowns and village centers, and it speaks to the way that we want to handle land use in the state of Vermont. I heard earlier state zoning, and we don't have state zoning. We have state regulation and state law, and there's local zoning, but the state gives guidelines on that. And by having a designated downtown or designated village center in your community, it gives your community benefits that you wouldn't necessarily have, access to funding, and they're those areas that the state and the community has decided that's where you want your development to take place. That's where it makes the most sense to take place in terms of maximizing the resources that we do have and not bringing them out deeper into the community and sprawling out. And one thing I did just want to say, just because I'm not sure of who is in the audience and how, we use the word affordable housing a lot, but I think it's important for people to understand what that really means, insofar as if you spend more than 30% of your income each year on your housing, that your housing is not affordable to you, and that you're paying too much. So that should be the measure by which you spend your precious dollars that you earn on your housing. And it's, yes. Yeah, oh, that's okay.
Yeah, we're gonna
We'll
leave
there.
time for questions, and I should have said that at the outset. So
Yeah. Yes. No, it's your housing expenses.
all your housing
All your housing
expenses.
expenses. So I just wanted to point that out because I think it's important for us to think of affordable housing in a much broader definition than what we tend to do that in our culture.
Did you have something else to say? Okay. So one of the things that we did in preparing for the panel today is got together last week to talk about the idea of tiny houses and how it fits into both our ideas about housing and how it can work at the local level and at the state level. And we had a really interesting conversation, and I thought we would share it with you about the ideas we think we can take from tiny house movement without fully embracing the entire aesthetic of tiny houses or the entire idea of it. How can we borrow some of the best of those ideas and implement them into our thinking about housing? Yep. So.
Sure,
We can thumb wrestle.
So what that got me thinking about was some of the things that are already happening in Vermont and even more specifically here in Brattleboro that are really different types of living in less space with less stuff. And also that can be more affordable than some of the more traditional options. And you've got some pretty cool things happening here in Windham County. To begin with, you've got a community land trust entity. The Windham and Windsor Housing Trust is here. It's created affordable rental apartments all around us right now. And, you know, just the easiest example to call out is the 2 floors above the co-op. That's affordable housing. And it will be affordable permanently. That housing will forever remain affordable to folks at lower incomes. The Windham and Windsor Housing Trust also has houses that they kind of co-own. Well, they're shared equity homes, which is another pretty novel idea, and Vermont's a leader in that. And Windham and Windsor Housing Trust is one of the oldest community land trust entities in the country and is often looked to as a model. But they will help somebody buy a home, and then when that person is ready to move on, then they fall back on an agreement that they signed when they first purchased it, that the owner will take just 25% of the equity in the home that it's gained since the time they bought it, and the remaining equity stays with that home on that land, and the next person, income eligible household, will buy that, and the price stays lower. So there are houses all around Brattleboro that will be easier to afford for folks, and they will remain perpetually affordable. This is interesting, and particularly right now, because the state of New York, in cooperation with New York City, has just announced a huge $1 million effort to try to create community land trust or a similar mechanism in New York. And Vermont's had it for 10 or 20 years, and it's just kind of silently working. So I just thought it was worth mentioning to folks that that's here and is option. You know, another thing that you've got here in Brattleboro is what is seen as a model for the whole state around encouraging accessory dwelling units. So essentially helping people who have room in their bigger old home or have a carriage house or a garage that they'd like to convert. There's technical assistance, and through actually the town of Brattleboro and local fundraising, there are grants that people can get and help with drawings to convert or create a housing unit within their existing property, which great, totally affordable,
And they're
environmentally.
Sorry, I was just going to say they're enabled by Vermont law as well. So it's not just a local, I'm looking sort of at Rod for this. It's not just a local zoning issue. They're a way of providing an additional small housing unit that is spelled out in Vermont state law. So a municipality can't zone it out. Yep. It's the state law trumps local. So,
you know, another way to think about tiny living is through home share. There's something called Home Share Now, or home that is available throughout the state, and it's essentially kind of a matchmaking service between someone who'd like to not necessarily create a whole separate apartment within their home, but would like to share a room, maybe in exchange for, you know, meal preparation or maybe some kind of services or extra support or transportation.
I home share.
There you go.
I home share in my time that I live in northern Vermont while I'm working in Montpelier. Yeah. So I share a house with a 63-year-old woman who would have had to have sold her house, and I rent a room and a bedroom from her, a bedroom and a bathroom from her, and it's a great alternative for people who need affordable housing.
It's another way to think about tiny living.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Commissioner, were there more ideas that you wanted to share in terms of what's transferable, in terms of the idea of tiny house, smaller space?
Jen's really touching on them. it feels to me on the state level, and Jen, I don't know if you agree, that it's more of a tiny living concept than the ability to really be able to necessarily fund public tiny house projects. But it's looking at your space differently. It's scaling back. There are projects that are going on all over the state, which I'm sure you all know, that are micro apartments, that are different ways of us thinking about our space, living with less, maximizing our resources, and making things more affordable. So,
I couldn't catch that last part, Commissioner.
making things more affordable.
Oh, okay. Thought you said something about a ripple. I don't
No.
Okay. This all fits into the larger idea of what is it that we're looking for in communities. And we had a meeting with the Regional Commission on Friday, really thinking about what is it that holds communities together in southern Vermont now, and what is it that we're trying to do more of? And how can the housing that we're foreseeing to exist in the future, how can the housing relate to other housing in that community? That we're really coming from a time when people were very individually focused. It was their house, their property, not necessarily in relation to the other homes, the other properties within them in the neighborhood. I think about it in terms of where I live on South Main Street. The houses are very close together, and where the windows are in relationship to the neighbors doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And where the property line is, it was about fitting homes into space as opposed to thinking about how this space works as a whole. And that's something I've been thinking about in terms of any kind of change in the size of lots or the size of homes. How do we want those homes to interact with each other and the community as a whole? So I'm wondering if either of you have had thoughts about that as well. Or not.
Silence.
Exactly. I mean, you've done quite a bit of projects in Algeirs, and I'm wondering how much that came into play, how that fits into the whole of Guilford Center.
Well, it's the interesting thing about Guilford is we have no zoning in Guilford, so there's nothing that really specifies how we should or shouldn't do anything. So in the village of Algeirs, which is part of Guilford, a small group of us formed a nonprofit, and we guided the socially responsible development of properties that became available on the market in the village of Algeirs. We wanted to protect the historic fabric of the town, and especially that section of town. And we bought land and held land, and we also wanted affordable housing. So we worked with Windham and Windsor Housing Trust to purchase the land, hold the land until they were ready to assemble their deal, and sold it to them, and they developed what is now 24 units of affordable housing in our community where we had none. It helped bring a water line to our village so that now those homes that exist there can have safe, clean drinking water when they need it, because they're going to need it. Some people have connected because their wells were terrible. It allowed us to expand our country store to have a cafe so that we now have a community gathering place, which is the heart of our town and where everybody goes. So we took it upon ourselves as a community to make those decisions, and the new buildings that were put there are incredibly energy efficient and innovative. They're not huge dwelling units.
I was just going to ask, what's the square footage on one of those apartments in downtown Guilford?
I don't know exactly, but there's one large building. There's 15 units in that building, and it's not that large. Mm-hmm. But it has, a state-of-the-art pellet boiler system in it. It's incredibly well insulated. It has, I want to say, if solar not on the property, I should ask Betsy. She'd probably know this off the top of her head. But it's smart. It's innovative. It was designed so that it would fit into the landscape in a traditional way. It's definitely modern, but it isn't. It's very thoughtful in its design, and they worked with the community to do that.
Is it on a bus line?
It is public transportation. So, there's municipal services, water and sewer. It's on the transportation route. So it has all of those things that you would really want, and it's in a designated village center. So I get to plug my own program with that one.
Jen, did you have anything you want to add?
I guess I would say that from the funding perspective, that the tax dollars that come our way that we hold in trust, where actually the money actually flows through something called the Vermont Housing and Conservation Trust. We're really holding it in trust for all the people in communities of Vermont, and so when we use those to fund a housing project, we looked for as many other benefits to come along with that housing. Housing's really a building block of communities, so we're looking for community revitalization aspects. So is it restoring a blighted building? Is it going to enable cleaning up a brownfield? Is it sometimes the money is used when there's a fire in a downtown or somewhere where there's lost an important building and it's not possible to rebuild it without a public sector help. And then we also achieve different goals with it too. I mean, primarily it's about creating quality, affordable homes, but also the housing that we build meets an energy standard that's above the state standard. So we're thinking about climate change and how we mitigate that. We think about location, not only in terms of how does it relate to a community center and transportation, but how does it relate to floodplains? How does it relate to flood hazard zones? One of the projects that we were able to fund along with Katie's department recently was the Red Clover Commons just outside of Brattleboro that's replacing some of the housing at Melrose Terrace that was flooded repeatedly. And I think we'll probably see a proposal for the second phase of that effort to move the Melrose Terrace units out of harm's way. So we're always looking for, if we're using those public dollars, we're always looking for to maximize the impact and achieve a lot of different public policy goals.
Thanks, Jen. So we want to make sure we spend the last 20 minutes turning it over to you about questions that you...
You told us about the bond issue, and I appreciate that, but could you tell us what the dollar value of the issue was?
We estimate that it's going to yield about $36 million. There'll be some amount that goes to transaction filing fees and that sort of thing. So we're hoping it's going to yield 34 to 35 in bond proceeds that we can put out to projects. And we're working right now with another entity, running all kinds of different scenarios to see what's going to create the maximum yield. And that bond should be going out in the next month or two.
The way the proceeds are divided up is that 25% of the bond will go to create housing for very low income, I believe. And what was is it 50% of
50%.
50%, thank you. I wasn't sure if it was 30. And that 25% of the bond will hit the 80 to 120% of AMI, which you'll hear the term workforce housing, which I can't stand. And then the rest will be based on what is needed throughout Vermont in terms of the communities. So, yep.
I've been thinking throughout the panels today about how when we're having more compact housing or smaller housing, how that means that our public spaces are even more valuable. And you've talked about that a little bit with the country store in Algeirs, but wondering how you think about public spaces from a policy perspective as you're building this new housing.
You know, that brings to mind another project that's happening right here in Brattleboro, and that's the former Lamplighter. So that I believe is going to be, it's going to be kind of tiny living, but folks will have support services if they need them. They're going to be made available to those who are have some real life challenges and need support to remain stably housed. But that space is going to be reconfigured, so not only so that it faces away from the road, but there's going to be public space on the interior. Public space, access, and particularly for VHCB, access to trails and the outdoor options is something we also think about when we have applications come before us. Well, is that what you were looking for? Oh, how do you incentivize it? Here. Yeah.
I don't know if we necessarily incentivize it. It definitely, I can say, makes for a more attractive project. That when you're having to score an application or defend an application in terms of funding, even if it's not part of the criteria and it adds to that interaction with the environment. And I have to say, in from my experience in working with the Housing Trust, that was something that was automatically part of the fiber of the project because it's the right thing to do. And that's something that I feel like when public dollars are being spent, people tend to do the right thing. And interaction with the community, the way that natural environment is used, even the placement of it in reference to the natural environment. There's a new project that's going to be taking place up in Putney, and I know that there was huge consideration with that of how that whole development would interplay with the environment there. And there was a power line to consider. So how do you really aesthetically and naturally make the most of the built environment, I think is a big consideration.
I think Emily brings up an excellent point, which is, yes, it is often implicit in what we're doing, but we know going forward that it needs to be explicit in order for it to be at the center and driving so many projects. I know, having written some papers in support of that project in Algeirs at the country store, like, that was absolutely an important component of it. And as people who are evaluating that, I think we need, on the policy side of things, to think about making the criteria more explicit that it must include public space. And we may disagree, but that's...
No. And I think that sort of comes to another issue where a lot of this has to take place on the local level. And so if you want change to take place in your community, be your change. Get out there, and this is where I'm going to get a little grassrooty, sorry.
You're in Brattleboro.
But as somebody who worked for local government, if you want to make things change, run for office. Please get out there and run for office instead of just having the same people run time and time. I'm not saying that to disparage them. I think there are lots of wonderful people who have multiple year terms, but if you want to make change, the very best way to do it is to run for office, participate on a committee or a commission, get appointed by your local legislative body, and make change. That is the very best way for it to happen. If you write letters to us, it doesn't help you on the local level. We get letters and emails all the time, and I don't know if you do, of something that's going on in your town. If you want to change, listened to the gentleman before talking about zoning and planning. Don't hide out. Get involved in your government. Change, be part of the changes of your rules. If you want them to change, go make them change. You can do that. That's the beautiful thing about Vermont, is that we get to have that local control. And if you want to make change, run for office. You go, and I'll tell you, you can go get your petition at your town clerk's office, get your signatures, and you can be on the ballot next March. Everybody go run for office.
I have a question.
No apology. Did you have something you wanted to jump in with, Jen? You guys were having a side conversation about another project, I think?
I guess I would just say, in terms of the power of the local level, is that we have an incredible opportunity around some new state resources through the housing bond. But that money does no good to anybody sitting in Montpelier, and we can't make the projects happen. We need folks at the local level to bring forward their best thinking and their best projects, and Brattleboro is pretty darn good at this, seeking state funding. But there's a unique opportunity, and we're going to be looking for some new creative ideas. We're going to set 10% of the housing bond aside for an innovation fund. So there's some room to try some new things and pilot some new approaches, and we're excited to see what comes forward.
There's a constant stream of people trying to move into this state, and could you, because this is going to be aired on BCTV at later dates, could you give a brainstorming of all the different places to look for affordable housing at this time? I'm also a home share person, but that's not in southern Vermont, as far as I know.
It's not.
Right, it's in Chittenden. Right, so Home Share Now and Home Share Vermont.
Expanding it to a statewide program.
Great.
I'm saying it. I'm not saying it is happening, but it is something that would be good to have that conversation to figure out a way to make it statewide.
It's something that you would support. If we,
Absolutely, yeah. And it's a great way to allow people to stay in their homes. Older people who aren't quite ready for that next step but are struggling to stay in their home, it provides them, even if it's just income, even if they don't need assisted living or anything like that in terms of meals or rides, they just are financially struggling to stay in their home. It gives them that little bit of money to help them pay their taxes, to make a roof repair that's needed, any of that stuff. It's a great opportunity, and you get to forge great relationships out of it from the whole human side. So I would love to see that.
So aside from Home Share Vermont and Home Share Now, which are up in Northern, can you tell us, or tell the audience for BCTV later, other places that people can look for housing that's affordable online, besides Craigslist?
I was going to say VHFA's Director of Affordable. Yeah. Sorry. And just for perspective, Jen worked as Deputy Commissioner in my department and has incredible knowledge. You have a career of just amazing work, and I'm so glad to have her as a resource to help me through. I was simply going to say that there's the Directory of Affordable Housing on the VHFA website. I could easily put together a series of website links that I could share. I don't know if there's going to be materials or a website in the after part of this that we could share out with anybody that was interested, but the Directory of Affordable Housing, if you go to VHFA's website, vhfa.org, and just type in Directory of Affordable Housing, it'll come up, and it lists all of the affordable housing opportunities throughout the state.
Yeah, and to that I would just add checking with your local housing nonprofit. Here again, it would be Windham and Windsor Housing Trust, but also because methods of advertising departments are really changing, I think Front Porch Forum is something that's unique to Vermont, and actually you see an awful lot of people that are finding both places, finding tenants and finding apartments through that forum as well. So I'd recommend that.
So we've got about 10 minutes. I see another question in the back.
Hey, Chris.
So I wanted to return to the figures that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk. And it seems to me that a part of the housing crisis is that minimum wage is $10 an hour.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what's being done about that. And also, it seems like, there's the Housing Trust and they've done amazing things, but you spoke too of how it's getting harder for private organizations to establish housing. So are we going to become a totally public housing community?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the trend? That's what I'm wondering.
So if I could, before we get to the housing piece, in terms of minimum wage increase, I can speak from where I sit in the Senate. It's majority leader in the Senate. We will be queuing up a bill for a minimum wage increase in January. Now, we'll see what happens at the executive branch, but we fully intend to push for a significant minimum wage increase. I just slipped that one in.
No.
Commissioner. Yes.
It was totally unrelated.
Yes.
We had, as a part of our housing agenda last session, in addition to the bond, we increased downtown tax credits so that gives, to try and give some incentives to make up the gap in that cost that it takes to make property livable or to improve property. And we did some slight tweaks so that priority housing projects could take place. That's another piece of it. But it's sort of that middle section and there's a lot of housing stock out there, especially in Chittenden, outside of Chittenden County, that it's existing, but the amount of investment that has to go into that is so big that people can't really afford to buy the house and then sink another $100,000 into it. So it's part of this much bigger conversation of jobs and wages and housing. It's really complicated. But on a statewide level, it is the highest priority. I can say that every bit of work that I do for the state is guided by 3 principles, and it makes it super easy for me. Does it help the economy? Is it making us more affordable? And are we protecting the most vulnerable? And if I'm proposing something that doesn't do those things, I'm not going to waste my time on it. I'm told those are not our priorities. So our priorities are very clear, and it's a heavy lift to get there, but we'll get there. It's just going to take time.
Anything to add, Jen?
Hi, I'm a small business owner here in Dummerston, Vermont. I've had a business for 30 years. I started out in a house like most small businesses in Vermont. And so we started out with a conditional use permit. You can't see any of our neighbors, so we're kind of secluded, so it worked out okay. And then I built a commercial building on Route 5 in Dummerston. And each one of those experiences, I didn't find that the local boards were supportive to us really small businesses. And so I recently retired from that, and I'm now committed to what you said you were looking for in communities. And in other words, the 22 to 30-year-old or 38-year-old demographics is really missing here in southern Vermont. And so I'm an Afghanistan combat vet, and so I've now dedicated my 10 acres that I have to this idea that I'm just educating myself on this weekend in regards to, I have 2 children that fit that demographics of 22 years old, and I listen to them struggle with the idea of how to move out of mom's house. And so it's energized a little bit personally, but it's also energized with the grace of God of standing here in front of you today as a combat vet. And so I have that 10 acres in Dummerston, and my question to you is, I find that some of the local boards are a little far behind in what the state is looking for as initiatives to keep our state, our beautiful state, in balance of housing, jobs, and the beautification of the state we live in. So my question to you is Dummerston open to this small accessory type idea if I meet all the building codes and zonings for a tiny house or tiny houses? Or do you have any experience with Dummerston?
I don't have any experience with Dummerston.
Yes.
But I think you should turn around.
Okay. Okay.
Because I'm pretty sure he's from Dummerston.
Oh, great.
And I'm pretty sure he had my job.
Okay. And then of this housing bond, the legislation that you just passed collectively as a group and went so well, is that basically for private landowners, or is that for like organizations like Windham Windsor Housing Trust, which I love too?
So the people who are eligible to apply, or the entities, are nonprofit organizations, excuse me, and municipalities. And we're hoping that private developers will partner with them and bring forward proposals. So the applications would technically come from a nonprofit entity or municipality, but there are many public-private partnerships.
Agency in Brattleboro?
It'd be Windham and Windsor or the town.
Are you looking to do a tiny house cluster development? Is that what you're looking to do? I had a really
If not, at least 2 houses.
So do you want to talk after?
Yeah, I'd love to.
Okay.
All right, thanks.
I'll be around.
Thanks.
And if I can't help you, I might be able to connect you with resources that... and this is sort of random, but we're having conversations with other state agencies, one of which is the Agency of Natural Resources, and trying to come up with some ideas and solutions for small rural communities to handle wastewater and to address that issue. So, food for thought. Okay.
So I think we're just about out of time, but I just want to make sure if there was a final question that you knew that you could certainly talk to us afterwards. Checking. Okay, so thank you so much, Commissioner, former Deputy Commissioner and Head of VHCB, Jen Holler, Katie Buckley. I'm, again, Becca Balint, and thanks so much for coming this conversation.
Thank
Have a good
you.
afternoon.